My husband looked at me across the kitchen island, slid a thick folder toward me, and said, "The investment visa file is ready. You just need to sign." He said it like he was asking me to pass the salt. The folder was neatly tabbed. Corporate transfer documents, immigration forms, a capital declaration summary, my name printed in black ink under founding shareholder consent. There was even a yellow sticky note marking the signature line. He smiled. Calm and confident? "It's just procedural. We're opening the Canada branch. This is good for the company." But I had built the first investor deck for that company at our dining table in Chicago. I had written the original bylaws myself when we incorporated in Illinois. I knew exactly what counted as just procedural, and I knew what didn't. What Kevin didn't know was that I had already seen the email from a Toronto immigration firm. I had already read Elizabeth Turner's name listed as the visa applicant. I had already noticed that the source of funds listed on her application was a transfer of Kevin's founder shares. What he didn't know was that I understood the structure better than he ever did. And what neither of them seemed to remember was this: that transfer required my written consent. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I looked at him and asked, "Who exactly is this visa for?" He blinked once. Just once. Then he said, "It's part of the expansion strategy." "You're overthinking it." I wasn't overthinking anything. I was calculating. I'm Monica Hayes. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a digital marketing strategist for a major e-commerce corporation in downtown Chicago. I've spent the last decade building brands from nothing, crafting narratives that make investors feel safe and customers feel loyal. I know how to read tone shifts in a pitch. I know how to spot inconsistencies in messaging. And more importantly, I know when someone is trying to control the narrative. Kevin Hayes, my husband of 9 years, is 37. He's an electrical engineer and the public face of Hayes Renewable Systems, the solar installation company we co-founded out of his parents' garage in Naperville. He likes to tell people he built it from scratch. He forgets to mention that I built the first investor relationships, wrote the branding strategy, and negotiated the tax credit presentations that secured our earliest contracts. In the beginning, it was 50-50. At least, that's what we told ourselves. I remember those nights in the garage, space heaters running, extension cords everywhere, Kevin soldering components while I sat on a folding chair editing our pitch deck. I registered the LLC online. I drafted the initial shareholder agreement using templates I modified at 2 a.m. I insisted on including a clause requiring unanimous founder approval for equity transfers. Kevin had laughed at the time. "Why so formal?" "It's just us." I had shrugged. "It's never just us once investors show up." He signed anyway. That clause was still there. The company grew faster than we expected. Federal renewable energy incentives boosted demand. Suburban homeowners wanted solar panels. Investors liked our clean narrative. Engineer husband. Marketing savvy wife. American small business success story. We were invited to speak at local entrepreneur events. Kevin became the CEO. I stayed listed as co-founder and chief brand strategist, though my full-time job remained separate. And somewhere along the way, something shifted. Kevin began traveling more. Board meetings became executive sessions I didn't need to attend. Our shared Google Drive folders were reorganized without explanation. He locked his phone with a new passcode. Then Elizabeth Turner entered the picture. She was 31, sharp, polished, a corporate immigration attorney hired to advise us on cross-border expansion. The first time we met, she complimented our brand positioning and told me she admired women in tech-adjacent leadership. She spoke quickly, confidently. She understood regulatory language. I liked her at first, but I started noticing the subtle changes. Kevin mentioned her name too often in casual conversation. Elizabeth thinks Canada has better growth incentives. Elizabeth says we should restructure before expansion. Elizabeth believes founder equity needs to be flexible. Flexible. One afternoon, while Kevin was in the shower, his phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I wasn't trying to snoop. I was reaching for my coffee mug. Her name flashed across the screen. Not Elizabeth Turner. Esk? Just Elizabeth. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I told myself I was projecting. Then I received the email. It was addressed to Kevin. But our shared corporate email routing occasionally forwarded compliance notices to me. The subject line read, "Investment Visa Application, Supporting Equity Documentation." I opened it. Applicant: Elizabeth Turner. Primary capital source: equity transfer from Kevin Hayes. Hayes Renewable Systems. Supporting documentation required: written consent from all founding shareholders. My name was listed beneath his. That was the moment my heartbeat slowed instead of sped up. They weren't just having an affair. They were planning an exit. The structure was obvious once I stepped back. Kevin would transfer a portion of his shares to Elizabeth, allowing her to qualify under a Canadian investment visa program. He would file for divorce. Assets would be divided under the assumption of reduced equity on his side. Then he would relocate to oversee expansion, joining her in Toronto under the guise of corporate growth. It was elegant. If I signed, Kevin stood across from me now, watching, waiting for my pen to move. "The board is aligned," he said carefully. "Everything's been arranged? Everything except the one detail they thought was automatic." I closed the folder gently and pushed it back toward him. "I'll review it," I said. He nodded, satisfied, as if the outcome were inevitable. But that night, after he went to bed, I pulled up the original incorporation documents from 9 years ago. I opened the bylaws. I scrolled down to Section 4. Founder Equity Protections. Unanimous written consent required for any transfer of founding shares. My signature was not a courtesy. It was a gate. And for the first time since Kevin said the words, "You just need to sign," I allowed myself to smile. Because I understood something he clearly didn't. They could arrange the visa. They could prepare the divorce. They could even align the board. But without me, none of it would move forward. Not 1 inch. The next morning, I made coffee like nothing had changed. Kevin kissed my cheek on his way out, his voice casual. "Don't overthink the paperwork. It's just a growth move. Just a growth move." I watched him leave through the kitchen window, his car backing out of the driveway we had bought 3 years after our first major investor came on board. That house existed because I had rewritten our pitch deck 6 times until it finally resonated. Because I had convinced a skeptical venture group that solar wasn't a trend, it was infrastructure. And now I was supposed to believe this was just expansion. I opened my laptop and logged into the corporate portal I still had access to as co-founder. My permissions hadn't been revoked. Not yet. The internal file server showed a new folder under Executive Planning. International Strategy, Phase 1. I clicked. There it was. Draft Share Transfer Agreement. Proposed Capital Redistribution. A memo titled Founder Transition and Relocation Timeline. Founder Transition. They weren't even subtle. The document outlined Kevin reducing his visible equity stake prior to filing for divorce. The language was careful. Strategic reallocation of founder equity for cross-border operational agility. But I knew corporate euphemisms. That was dilution before marital asset division. I downloaded everything. Then I opened the original shareholder agreement from 9 years ago. I still remembered typing it in our old apartment, sitting on the floor because we couldn't afford a proper desk. Section 4. Subsection C. Any transfer of founding shares requires written consent from all listed founders, regardless of majority board approval. That clause existed because I had insisted on it. Back then, Kevin had rolled his eyes. "You really think we'll ever need that?" I had told him, "I don't plan for trust. I plan for structure." He had laughed. Now structure was the only thing standing between me and erasure. At noon, I received a calendar invite from Elizabeth. Subject line: Strategic Alignment Check-in. Bold. I accepted. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon at company headquarters in Chicago. I chose a navy blazer instead of black. Neutral. Controlled. When I walked into the conference room, Elizabeth was already there, seated with a leather folder open in front of her. Kevin stood by the window, hands in his pockets, projecting confidence. Monica, Elizabeth said smoothly, we wanted to walk you through the International Compliance Framework. Compliance Framework. She slid a document toward me. As you know, for an investment visa application under the Canadian Entrepreneur Stream, the applicant must demonstrate lawful access to capital. In this case, Kevin is reallocating a portion of his founder shares. I looked at her directly. To you. She didn't flinch. To facilitate expansion oversight. I would be serving in a cross-border legal capacity. Kevin jumped in. It's temporary. Once the branch is stable, we can reassess structure. Reassess. I let silence settle in the room. And the divorce? I asked calmly. Kevin's jaw tightened. That's separate. Separate. Elizabeth folded her hands. We understand this is personal. But legally, the transfer is clean. The board has reviewed it. The board. Has the board reviewed Section 4 of the founding bylaws? I asked. A flicker crossed her face. Just for a second. We believe board majority authority supersedes, she began. It doesn't, I said evenly. Founder transfer protections override simple majority votes. That clause was never amended. Kevin shifted his weight. You're being technical. Yes, I replied. That's how contracts work. For the first time. Elizabeth's tone sharpened slightly. Monica. Refusing to sign could delay expansion and negatively impact investor confidence. Investor confidence. There it was. The pressure point. I'm not refusing, I said. I'm reviewing. Kevin exhaled sharply. What more is there to review? It's straightforward. No, I said quietly. It's not. I stood, gathered the documents, and placed them back into the folder. I'll need full disclosure of all financial allocations tied to this visa process. Legal fees. Consulting retainers. Any reclassification of equity prior to filing. Kevin stared at me. You don't trust me. Trust. That word felt almost nostalgic. I trust documentation, I said. I left the conference room without raising my voice. Back in my car, I sat for a moment and let my hands rest on the steering wheel. My pulse was steady. That was the strangest part. I wasn't spiraling. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was analyzing. That night, after Kevin fell asleep, I accessed our joint financial overview. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was verifying. Under international legal consulting, I found 3 recent transfers, large ones, paid directly from corporate accounts to Elizabeth's firm. Not personal funds. Corporate funds. I pulled the general ledger export and cross-referenced the payment codes. They were categorized under expansion advisory. But the invoice notes referenced applicant preparation. Applicant. Not company. I downloaded the ledger. If Kevin had used company capital to fund his mistress's immigration pathway, that wasn't just betrayal. That was a fiduciary issue. The next morning, I called someone Kevin didn't know about. A corporate attorney I had consulted once years ago when we first raised outside capital. Her name was Rebecca Lawson. Calm. Methodical. Unimpressed by drama. I need a quiet review. I told her. No filings yet? Just analysis. She agreed to meet. As I hung up, Kevin walked into the kitchen adjusting his tie. Did you think about the signature? He asked casually. I met his eyes. I did, I said. And I'm still thinking. He smiled as if patience were on his side. But what he didn't understand was this. The longer he assumed compliance, the more documentation I collected, by the time he filed for divorce. If he filed for divorce, I wouldn't be reacting. I would be positioned. That afternoon, I received another email from the Toronto immigration firm. Reminder. Founding shareholder consent form pending. Pending? I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. They thought the obstacle was emotional. They thought I was just a wife delaying the inevitable. They forgot I was the co-founder who wrote the structure they were now trying to maneuver around. And structures don't collapse because someone feels guilty. They collapse because someone ignores the fine print. I wasn't going to ignore anything. Rebecca didn't react when I finished explaining. She simply leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and asked, "Do you want protection? Or do you want retaliation?" The question hung in the air between us. "I want structural protection," I said. "If he wants to burn the marriage down, that's personal. But he doesn't get to quietly transfer equity and use corporate funds to finance it." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Good. Because those are two separate battles." I slid the printed ledger across the table. These payments were categorized as expansion advisory, but the invoice notes mention applicant preparation for an investment visa. She scanned the pages without rushing. "And the transfer of founder shares?" she asked. "Drafted. Not executed. They need my signature." Rebecca's lips curved slightly. "Then they're stalled. For now." She tapped the ledger with her pen. "If company funds were used to finance a personal immigration strategy for a related party that raises fiduciary duty questions, especially if not disclosed to the board." "He claims the board is aligned," I said. "Aligned doesn't mean informed." That distinction mattered. Rebecca outlined the possible paths in calm, unemotional language. I could refuse to sign and leave it at that. I could formally notify the board of potential misclassification of funds. I could escalate to an internal audit request. Or I could sit quietly and wait for Kevin to move first. Which option gives me leverage without detonating the company? I asked. "Documentation first," she said. "Then formal notice. No accusations. Just compliance language." Compliance language. I left her office with a checklist instead of a meltdown. That alone felt like power. Back at home, Kevin was on a call when I walked in. He was pacing in the living room, voice low but urgent. "Yes. The consent is procedural. It'll be signed," he said. "Procedural." He ended the call and looked at me. "You talked to anyone about this?" he asked casually. "About expansion," I replied. "I review company documents." "That's normal." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been distant." I held his gaze. "You've been planning a relocation with another woman." Silence. For a moment, the mask slipped. "It's not what you think," he said automatically. "It's exactly what I think," I replied. "You're transferring founder equity to Elizabeth, so she qualifies for an investment visa. Then you'll file for divorce and call it strategic restructuring." He didn't deny it. Instead, he exhaled sharply. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Harder? For who?" I asked quietly. He ran a hand through his hair. "Monica, we've grown apart. The company needs to expand. Elizabeth has the legal expertise to handle international compliance. It's efficient. Efficient. So is a formal board disclosure?" I said. "Have you provided one?" His jaw tightened again. "The board trusts me." "That's not what I asked." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If you block this, you hurt investor confidence. You hurt the employees. You hurt yourself." There it was. The pressure angle. I didn't respond emotionally. I didn't raise my voice. "I won't sign until I see full financial transparency," I said. "All legal invoices, all reallocation drafts, and written confirmation that corporate funds weren't used for personal immigration preparation." His expression shifted from persuasion to irritation. "You think I'd risk everything for that?" he snapped. "Yes," I said evenly. "I think you already did." That night, I requested a formal export of the last 6 months of categorized expansion expenditures through the internal finance portal. As co-founder, I still had the authority. Within hours, I received a polite email from the company's CFO asking why. I replied simply, "Routine founder review." Routine. The next morning, the CFO's assistant sent me a more detailed breakdown than I had initially pulled. It confirmed what I suspected. Multiple payments to Elizabeth's firm were coded under expansion advisory, but included line items referencing applicant documentation, personal asset verification, and cross-border residency preparation. Residency preparation. I forwarded everything to Rebecca. Her reply was short. "This is not clean." That afternoon, I received a message from Elizabeth. "We need to talk privately." It read, I agreed to meet her at a downtown coffee shop near the office. She arrived composed, dressed in a tailored gray suit. "No visible anxiety. You're escalating unnecessarily," she said without preamble. "The visa process requires timely submission." "I'm aware," I said. She leaned forward slightly. "Kevin is prepared to proceed with divorce. You'll receive equitable distribution. Blocking this only delays the inevitable. Is that what you tell your clients?" I asked calmly. "That bypassing disclosure requirements is inevitable." Her eyes hardened. "Be careful." "With what?" "With implying misconduct." "I'm not implying," I said. "I'm documenting." For the first time, her composure cracked. "Monica," she said, lowering her voice, "if you force an audit, regulators could get involved. That affects everyone." "Exactly. I don't want regulators involved," I replied. "I want transparency." She stood abruptly. "You're being vindictive." "No," I said. "I'm being precise." After she left, I sat alone for several minutes, staring at my untouched coffee. This wasn't about jealousy anymore. It wasn't even about the affair. It was about erasure. Kevin thought he could quietly transfer the structure I built. Elizabeth thought she could interpret around a clause I wrote. They both believed my role was emotional, not structural. That was their mistake. That evening, I drafted a formal internal memo requesting a compliance review of all expansion-related expenditures tied to international relocation. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't mention the affair. I simply cited founder oversight authority and fiduciary standards. Before sending it, I paused. This was the line. Once submitted, it would move beyond marriage. It would become institutional. I clicked send. Within minutes, I received confirmation that the request had been logged with the audit committee. And somewhere in Toronto, a visa file was still marked pending. They thought my power was sentimental. They were about to discover it was procedural. The audit committee responded faster than I expected. At 8:30 the next morning, I received a formal notice. Founder oversight inquiry, preliminary review initiated. No accusations. No conclusions. Just process. Kevin called me within minutes. "What did you do?" he demanded. "I requested compliance clarification," I said calmly. "You blindsided the board." I informed the board. His breathing was uneven. "You're escalating this." "No," I replied. "You did when you used company funds without full disclosure." There was a long silence. "You're going to regret this," he said finally. I didn't answer. By noon, the CFO had been asked to provide supporting documentation for all expansion-related expenditures tied to international advisory services. The email chain was professional but tense. Words like verification, classification, and related party disclosure appeared repeatedly. Related party. That phrase would make any executive nervous. At 3 p.m, an emergency executive meeting was scheduled for the following day. Kevin forwarded the calendar invite to me with no message attached. He wanted me there. He wanted control of the room. The next morning, I walked into headquarters early. The building felt different, like something fragile had shifted beneath the surface. Conversations quieted when I passed. Inside the executive conference room, the atmosphere was restrained but sharp. The CFO, Daniel, sat with printed ledgers in front of him. 2 board members attended via video conference. Elizabeth sat beside Kevin. Posture immaculate. Kevin opened the meeting. "There seems to be confusion regarding the international expansion framework," he began. "Monica has requested clarification." "Requested clarification." Daniel cleared his throat. "We've identified several invoices coded under expansion advisory that reference individual applicant preparation. We need to confirm whether these expenses were authorized under corporate policy." Kevin's jaw tightened. They were strategic. Daniel didn't react. Were they disclosed as related party transactions? Elizabeth leaned forward. The services provided were within the scope of cross-border structuring. Daniel didn't look convinced. The invoice language references residency preparation. The room grew still. I didn't speak yet. I let the numbers do the work. One board member's voice came through the speaker. Kevin, were any of these services directly tied to your personal relocation or to Min's? Turner's immigration status? Kevin hesitated. That hesitation was louder than any admission. It's intertwined, he said finally. The expansion required legal structuring. Elizabeth's presence in Canada would facilitate oversight. So the company funded her visa preparation, the board member asked. It funded expansion, Kevin corrected. I finally spoke. The founder bylaws require unanimous consent for equity transfers, I said evenly. I have not granted consent. Additionally, any use of corporate funds for personal immigration support must be explicitly disclosed. Elizabeth's composure tightened. There is no personal benefit outside strategic alignment. I looked at her directly. Are you listed as the visa applicant? She didn't answer immediately. Yes, she said. And are you receiving founder equity as proof of capital access? That was under consideration. Under consideration? The board member on the call exhaled audibly. This is exactly why disclosure matters. Kevin's frustration spilled through. You're acting like I committed fraud. No one is saying that, Daniel replied carefully. But classification and authorization must align. Kevin turned to me. You could have handled this privately. I did, I said. When I asked for transparency, the meeting ended with a formal decision. The audit committee would conduct a full internal review of expansion-related expenditures. During that period, all pending equity transfers would be temporarily paused. Paused. Not canceled. Not denied. Paused. But in visa terms, pause meant delay. After the meeting, Kevin followed me into the hallway. You're humiliating me, he said through clenched teeth. I'm protecting the structure, I replied. You're jealous? That word almost made me laugh. This isn't about jealousy, I said quietly. It's about governance. He stared at me like he didn't recognize me. Do you even care about what we had? He asked. I care about what we built, I answered. And you're treating it like a passport application. He didn't respond. That afternoon, I received another email from the Toronto immigration firm. Due to pending ownership verification, the application cannot proceed until required founder consent is received. Cannot proceed. I closed my laptop and sat still for a long time. This wasn't revenge. It was arithmetic. Every action had a structural consequence. That evening, Elizabeth texted me for the first time outside formal communication. You're risking regulatory attention? She wrote. I stared at the message before replying. Only if something was done improperly. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. You're not thinking long-term, she responded. I smiled faintly. I had been thinking long-term since the day we incorporated. Later that night, Kevin tried a different approach. He poured 2 glasses of wine and placed one in front of me at the kitchen table. We don't have to destroy each other, he said softly. I'm not destroying anything, I replied. You could sign, take a buyout, walk away clean. There it was. You've already decided I'm walking away, I said. He looked down. I thought it would be easier, he admitted. Easier? For who? I asked again. He didn't answer. Instead, he said, the board won't back you if this spirals. I met his eyes steadily. They already did. The next morning, I received a confidential email from one of the independent board members. We need a private discussion regarding governance safeguards. Governance safeguards. The battle had shifted. This was no longer a marital dispute. It was institutional risk. And Kevin still didn't understand that the most dangerous move he made wasn't the affair. It was assuming I wouldn't read the fine print. I met the independent board member at a quiet hotel lounge 2 blocks from headquarters. He introduced himself simply as Thomas Reed, though I had seen his name on shareholder reports for years. Late 50s. Careful eyes. The kind of man who measured risk in silence rather than noise. "Thank you for coming," he said, setting a leather folder on the table. "This conversation stays off record." "I understand," I replied. He studied me for a moment before speaking again. "The audit committee has concerns, not just about classification of expenses, but about timing." "Timing?" I asked. "Relocation planning, equity transfer drafts, divorce filings rumored to be imminent, all within the same quarter." The word divorce felt strangely clinical in his mouth. "I didn't initiate any of that," I said. "I'm aware," he replied. "But perception matters. Investors are sensitive to governance instability. Governance instability. That was the language of survival." Thomas opened his folder and slid several documents toward me. Preliminary audit summaries, transaction timelines, internal emails that I hadn't yet seen. "Your memo triggered a review," he said. "But what concerns me more is the lack of documented board authorization for certain advisory payments." "Were they approved at all?" I asked. "They were coded under executive discretion." Executive discretion, which meant Kevin. Thomas leaned back. "If this becomes public, it's not just a marital issue. It's a fiduciary oversight problem." "I never wanted publicity," I said quietly. "I wanted clarity." "And you were right to demand it," he replied. That sentence landed differently. "Right." He closed the folder. "There will likely be a formal board session to address this. Before that happens, I need to understand your position." "My position?" I asked. "Are you seeking control or protection?" The question sounded familiar. Rebecca had asked something similar. "I'm seeking structural accountability," I said. "I'm not trying to seize power. I'm trying to prevent unilateral misuse." Thomas nodded slowly. "That answer matters." He hesitated before adding, "There's another issue." I waited. "The valuation model Kevin presented for international expansion assumes equity dilution that may not align with founder protections." My pulse remained steady. "They plan to dilute before formal transfer?" I asked. "Draft language suggests it. So not only were they transferring shares, they were reshaping ownership percentages. Without me." Thomas watched my reaction carefully. "If that dilution had passed quietly, your equity position could have shifted before divorce proceedings." I didn't speak for several seconds. Not because I was shocked, because I was confirming the pattern. This wasn't impulsive betrayal. It was structured removal. "Has the board approved any dilution?" I asked. "No." "Then it doesn't exist," I said. "Not yet," Thomas replied. "But the attempt is documented." That word again. Documented. After the meeting, I walked several blocks before calling Rebecca. They drafted dilution language. I told her, "Without your consent." "Yes." "Then they were testing structural boundaries," she said evenly. "What happens if the board votes against Kevin?" "Temporary suspension is possible. Permanent removal if fiduciary breach is confirmed." I didn't feel triumph. I felt gravity. That evening, Kevin came home later than usual. "We need to talk," he said immediately. "We are talking?" I replied. "The board is overreacting." Or responding. He paced the living room like he used to in the garage when a component wouldn't align. "You don't understand the pressure," he said. "Investors want aggressive expansion. Canada was the next logical step. With your attorney as beneficiary. With my partner in expansion," he corrected sharply. "Partner." Was I informed? I asked. He stopped pacing. "You would have resisted." "Yes," I said. "That's the point of consent." He exhaled heavily. "You're turning this into war." "No," I replied. "You turned this into maneuvering." For the first time, frustration gave way to something else on his face. "Fear. The board might suspend me," he said quietly. "Then you should have disclosed properly." I answered. He looked at me as if hoping I would soften. "I can fix this," he said. "If you withdraw the compliance request." There it was. "You want me to retract documented concern?" I said slowly. "Yes." No. He stared at me in disbelief. You'd risk the company over a technicality. It's not a technicality, I said. It's fiduciary duty. He laughed bitterly. You sound like a lawyer. I sound like a founder. That word hung between us. Founder. He had been comfortable calling me that in public when it served branding. Now it threatened his authority. The next morning, a formal board meeting was scheduled for 72 hours later. Subject line: Executive Authority Review. Executive Authority. Kevin received the notification while standing in the kitchen. They're voting, he said flatly. Yes, I replied. You wanted this. I wanted transparency. He shook his head slowly. You've changed. No, I said. You forgot who I was. After he left for the office, I opened the original incorporation file again. 9 years ago, I had typed our names side by side under founding shareholders. I had insisted on mutual consent for equity movement. I had believed it was precaution. Now it was leverage. My phone buzzed. A message from Thomas. Be prepared. The audit findings are stronger than anticipated. Stronger? That meant documented breach. Not ambiguity. I sat back and closed my eyes briefly. This wasn't about the visa anymore. It wasn't even about Elizabeth. It was about control of structure. And in 72 hours, the board would decide whether Kevin retained it. For the first time since he slid that folder across the kitchen island, I felt something close to inevitability. He thought the signature was the obstacle. He didn't realize the structure itself had already shifted. And once boards begin reviewing fiduciary conduct, the outcome rarely favors the person who assumed consent. The countdown had started. The emergency board meeting began at 9 sharp. I walked into the conference room without hesitation, though technically I wasn't required to attend. But I was still listed as co-founder, and founder status carried its own gravity. Kevin was already seated at the head of the table. Elizabeth sat to his right, composed as ever, a legal pad in front of her. Daniel from finance arranged documents with mechanical precision. 2 independent board members joined via secure video call. The air felt different from any meeting we had held before. This wasn't strategy. This was review. Kevin cleared his throat. Let's proceed. The audit committee chair, Margaret Collins, began reading from a prepared summary. Preliminary review of expansion-related expenditures indicates potential misclassification of legal services directly tied to individual immigration preparation, she said evenly. Additionally, draft documents referencing founder equity dilution were circulated without formal board vote. Without formal board vote. Kevin leaned forward. Those drafts were exploratory. Margaret didn't look up. Exploratory drafts should not imply structural change without consent. Elizabeth finally spoke. The services in question were part of international compliance strategy, she said smoothly. The applicant status was incidental to expansion oversight. Margaret's voice remained neutral. The applicant listed as you. Silence followed. Kevin interjected quickly. Elizabeth's relocation would facilitate Canadian operations. And was founder consent obtained for equity transfer? Margaret asked. Kevin's gaze shifted briefly toward me. No, he admitted. Not yet. Margaret nodded once. And yet visa documentation was initiated. That was the turning point. They hadn't expected the timeline to be scrutinized. Kevin tried again. It was preparatory. No transfer occurred. But corporate funds were used, Daniel said quietly, sliding a printed invoice forward, and disclosure language was absent. Kevin's frustration surfaced. This is being blown out of proportion. I spoke calmly. The bylaws require unanimous founder consent for equity transfer. That clause exists to prevent unilateral dilution. Elizabeth's tone sharpened slightly. The board has authority to amend governance frameworks. Yes, I replied, but not retroactively without founder ratification. Margaret folded her hands. This board's responsibility is to shareholders and fiduciary standards, she said. Personal matters are irrelevant. Structural compliance is not personal matters. The affair had officially left the room. Kevin exhaled slowly, trying to regain composure. Are we really jeopardizing expansion over paperwork? He asked. Margaret met his gaze directly. We are reviewing executive conduct? Executive conduct. The words hit harder than any accusation. A board member on video leaned forward. Was the board formally notified that equity transfer to Mimsy Turner would serve as capital proof for her personal investment visa? Kevin hesitated again. No. The second silence was heavier than the first. Margaret closed her folder. The audit committee recommends a temporary suspension of pending equity transfers and a formal vote regarding executive authority pending full review. There it was. Kevin's expression hardened. You're suspending me. Pending review, Margaret corrected. Elizabeth remained still, but I noticed her fingers tighten around her pen. The meeting adjourned without resolution. But the direction was clear. Afterward, Kevin followed me into the hallway. You orchestrated this, he said under his breath. I requested compliance, I replied. You've turned them against me. I didn't write the invoices. His jaw flexed. You think you're winning, he said. I'm not competing, I answered. I'm enforcing structure. Elizabeth approached cautiously. This escalation benefits no one, she said quietly. It benefits governance, I replied. She looked at me with something that wasn't anger. It was calculation. If regulators get involved, she said carefully, this could damage all of us. That was the first time she had used the word regulators. Interesting. I haven't contacted regulators, I said. Yet. Her composure flickered. Kevin stepped between us slightly. Stop threatening. I'm not threatening, I said evenly. I'm responding. By late afternoon, internal messaging systems were buzzing. Employees sensed tension at the executive level. Investors requested clarification on expansion delays. The Toronto immigration firm sent a formal notice to Kevin's corporate email. Application status. On hold pending verified founder consent and ownership validation. On hold. That phrase carried more weight than it appeared to. Kevin forwarded the notice to me without comment. I didn't respond. That evening, the board chairman sent an official memo. Formal vote regarding temporary suspension of CEO authority scheduled in 72 hours. 72 hours. The same time frame that had once separated a visa application from approval now separated Kevin from potential removal. At home, the silence was thick. Kevin poured himself a drink without offering me one. You're destroying everything, he said quietly. No, I replied. You assumed I wouldn't read the documents. He looked at me as if I had betrayed him. You could have signed, he said. Yes, I answered. I could have. We stood there for a long moment. Two founders in a house built on equity, neither of us fully owned anymore. You don't understand the pressure of leading, he said finally. I understand accountability, I replied. He didn't argue. Later that night, I received a private message from Margaret. Be prepared to speak at the vote. Speak. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark living room. This had moved beyond marriage, beyond jealousy, beyond even the visa. The board was no longer asking whether the expansion made sense. They were asking whether the leadership could be trusted. And Kevin still believed the problem was my refusal to sign. He hadn't realized the real issue was that the signature line had revealed everything else. 72 hours later, I walked into the boardroom knowing the decision would redraw everything. The room was quieter than usual. Not tense in a chaotic way, tense in a deliberate way. Margaret sat at the head of the table this time. Kevin sat 2 seats down, no longer at the center. Elizabeth was present, but not as confidently positioned. She had placed herself slightly back from the main line of sight. That shift alone said more than any statement. Margaret began without ceremony. This session is to address executive authority in light of preliminary audit findings. No one mentioned marriage. No one mentioned the affair. No one mentioned Canada. Structure only. Daniel distributed updated audit summaries. The language had sharpened. Unauthorized allocation. Failure to disclose related party involvement. Governance oversight risk. Kevin read silently, jaw tight. "I want to clarify," he said finally, voice steady but strained. "There was no intent to deceive." Margaret nodded once. "Intent is not the sole consideration. Disclosure is—" A board member on video leaned forward. "Kevin, were you aware that the founder bylaws require unanimous consent for share transfer?" "Yes," he said. "And yet visa documentation was initiated without that consent." "Yes." The admission hung in the air like a cracked foundation. "It was preparatory," he added quickly. "No transfer was executed." "But corporate funds were used in preparation," Daniel said. Kevin didn't respond. Margaret turned to me. "Monica, as co-founder, you requested compliance review. Do you wish to make a statement?" I had prepared something brief, not emotional, not accusatory. "I built the original governance framework," I said calmly. "The consent clause exists to prevent unilateral dilution or transfer of founder equity. I did not sign because I was not provided full disclosure. This is not about retaliation. It is about fiduciary integrity." The room was still. "I did not contact regulators." I continued. "I did not go public. I requested internal review. That is the proper channel." Margaret nodded again. Elizabeth shifted in her seat. "With respect," she said. "International expansion required speed. Delays cost opportunity, and bypassing governance costs trust." Margaret replied. That was the moment I knew the vote would not favor Kevin. A motion was formally introduced. Temporary suspension of Kevin Hayes from executive authority, pending full audit completion and governance restructuring review. Kevin stared at the table. "You're suspending me over procedural disagreements," he said quietly. "This is not procedural," Margaret answered. "This is governance risk." Hands were raised. One by one. Majority. The decision passed. Effective immediately. Kevin was relieved of operational authority. He didn't explode. He didn't shout. He simply sat there, absorbing the shift. Margaret outlined the interim structure. An oversight committee would manage executive functions temporarily. Financial transfers above a certain threshold would require dual authorization. Expansion planning would be frozen pending review. Elizabeth stood slowly. "I will step back from advisory capacity during the review," she said. That was self-preservation. No one stopped her. As the meeting adjourned, Kevin remained seated while others filed out. I gathered my documents quietly. "Monica," he said behind me. I paused but didn't turn immediately. "You're satisfied?" he asked. I faced him then. "I'm stabilized," I replied. He shook his head faintly. "You think they'll hand you control?" "I think they'll enforce structure." "That's not the same thing." "No," I said. "It's better." Outside the building, the air felt strangely lighter. My phone buzzed as I stepped onto the sidewalk. An email from the Toronto immigration firm. Application status update. File placed under extended hold due to unresolved ownership verification and executive status review. Extended hold. Not denial yet? But movement had stopped. I slipped the phone back into my bag. Kevin exited the building a few minutes later. Not escorted, but clearly diminished. "We can fix this," he said, catching up to me. "If you withdraw the compliance escalation, I can negotiate with the board. It's not mine to withdraw anymore." I said, "It's institutional." He ran a hand through his hair. Frustration raw now. "You've turned them against me." "I didn't change the documents," I said. "I revealed them." He looked at me as if trying to reconcile the woman who once sat on a folding chair in a garage with the one standing in front of him now. "You could have just signed," he said again, almost pleading. "Yes," I replied softly. "And you would have erased me." That was the first time he had no immediate response. We stood there in silence. Two founders who had once promised equal partnership. "This isn't revenge," I said quietly. "It's consequence." He looked down at the pavement. "For what?" he asked. "For assuming I wouldn't understand the structure." He exhaled slowly. "I underestimated you," He admitted. Yes. I said. That was the truth neither of us had said aloud until now. Later that evening, I received a formal board communication requesting my availability for interim strategy coordination. They weren't offering me Kevin's position. They were asking for stability. That mattered. I sat alone in the living room that night, reviewing the original incorporation document again. 9 years ago, we had signed side by side. Equal founders. He had assumed the clause was symbolic. It wasn't. The visa had stalled. The CEO had been suspended. And the board was no longer asking whether I would sign. They were asking whether I would lead. The confidential meeting with Thomas happened the morning after Kevin's suspension. We didn't meet at headquarters this time. He chose a quiet conference suite at a downtown hotel. Neutral ground. Away from curious employees and tense executives. Things are moving quickly, he said as soon as the door closed. They needed to, I replied. He studied me carefully, as if recalibrating his assessment of who I was. The audit committee's deeper review uncovered more than misclassified invoices, he said. I didn't interrupt. There were internal draft projections modeling founder equity dilution scenarios. He continued. Your percentage would have shifted before any formal vote. I felt something cold settle in my chest. But my voice remained steady. Without my consent. Yes. Was the board aware? Not formally. That word again. Thomas placed a slim folder in front of me. These drafts were prepared under executive directive. They weren't executed. But the intent to restructure equity pre-divorce is documented. Documented. I absorbed the weight of that quietly. If this becomes regulatory, he added, it shifts from governance correction to potential compliance exposure. I haven't contacted regulators. I said again. I know, he replied. And that restraint is being noticed. That surprised me. In what way? I asked. You requested internal review rather than external escalation. That signals structural loyalty. Structural loyalty. I almost smiled at the phrase. I'm not trying to burn the company, I said. I built too much of it. Thomas nodded. The board is considering long-term restructuring, he said. Not just temporary suspension. We need to know whether you're prepared to assume expanded authority. The question was direct. Authority over what? I asked. Brand strategy. Investor communication. Potentially voting control if equity redistribution occurs. Voting control. The irony was sharp. Kevin had tried to dilute me quietly. Now the board was discussing strengthening my position. I don't want control for the sake of control, I said. I want safeguards written clearly. That's the right answer, Thomas said. Later that afternoon, I received an official notice from the audit committee requesting full access to my original founder documentation archive. They wanted confirmation of the consent clause history. I forwarded the incorporation files, time-stamped and preserved, within hours. I was notified that the immigration firm had formally requested updated documentation verifying Kevin's executive status. Executive status. He no longer had it. The visa file was no longer just pending consent. It was pending stability. At home that evening, Kevin was unusually quiet. They're reviewing everything, he said without looking at me. I know. They think I manipulated equity. You drafted dilution models. It was strategic, he said defensively. In case you resisted. In case I resisted, I repeated softly. He finally looked at me. I needed flexibility. You needed compliance, I replied. He ran a hand across his face. Elizabeth's firm is reconsidering representation, he admitted. Of course they were. Professional risk changes loyalty quickly. She's worried about her license, he added. That's reasonable, I said. He let out a hollow laugh. You don't even sound angry. I'm not, I replied. That was the strangest part. The betrayal had already calcified into something colder, clarity. The next morning, the board scheduled another session, this time focused on governance reform proposals. Reform. The draft included mandatory dual authorization for capital transfers, enhanced disclosure of related party transactions, and reaffirmation of founder consent protections. In other words, the structure I had written 9 years ago was being reinforced. During the session, Margaret addressed the room firmly. "This is not about personal misconduct," she said. "It is about preventing structural vulnerability." Kevin remained silent throughout most of it. When discussion shifted to leadership continuity, Thomas spoke. "Stability requires credibility," he said. "We must demonstrate that governance safeguards function." His eyes briefly met mine. A formal proposal was introduced. Creation of a chief strategy and governance role with expanded oversight authority, to be held by a founding shareholder. They didn't say my name immediately. They didn't need to. Kevin finally spoke. "You're rewarding obstruction," he said. "No," Margaret replied. "We're rewarding compliance." The vote was not taken that day, but the direction was unmistakable. After the meeting, Elizabeth approached me in the hallway. "You understand this could have been resolved quietly," she said. "Quietly for who?" I asked. "For everyone. For you," I said. Her composure wavered slightly. "If regulators step in, this becomes bigger than you," she warned. "I haven't contacted regulators," I replied. "But you could—" "Yes," I said. "And I haven't—" That was the difference. That evening, I received a final update from the Toronto firm. Due to executive status uncertainty and incomplete ownership verification, the application has been placed on indefinite administrative hold. Indefinite. I stared at the word for a long time. Kevin came into the kitchen while I was still reading. "It's on hold," he said flatly. "I know." He leaned against the counter, exhausted. "I never thought you'd go this far," he admitted. "I didn't go anywhere," I said. "I stayed inside the structure." He closed his eyes briefly. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now the board decides whether governance reform is permanent. And you? I decide whether I'm willing to lead inside it." For the first time, he looked unsure of the outcome. Not of the marriage, of the company. The visa had stalled. The executive authority had shifted, and the structure I once wrote in a small apartment was now determining the future of an 8-figure enterprise. They thought the obstacle was my signature. They were beginning to understand the obstacle was the framework itself. The final vote was scheduled for Friday morning at 9. I arrived 10 minutes early, not out of nerves but out of habit. Punctuality was control. Control was clarity. The boardroom felt different this time. No chaos. No raised voices. Just documentation stacked neatly at each seat and a quiet understanding that something permanent was about to be decided. Kevin sat halfway down the table. No longer at the head. His tie was slightly crooked, a detail he would never have allowed before. Elizabeth was not present. Her absence said more than any defense could have. Margaret opened the session without small talk. "This meeting will address permanent executive restructuring following audit findings." Daniel distributed the final audit report. The language was sharper than the preliminary version. Improper classification of legal services tied to individual immigration preparation. Failure to disclose related party benefit. Draft equity dilution models prepared without founder consent. No criminal accusation. No sensational language. Just facts. Kevin cleared his throat. "I maintain that expansion strategy required flexibility," he said. "There was no intent to defraud." Margaret nodded slightly. "Intent is not the sole measure. Disclosure and adherence to governance safeguards are." A board member on video spoke next. "Investor confidence has stabilized only because corrective action was initiated quickly. We must ensure long-term structural integrity." Structural integrity. That phrase had become the heartbeat of every conversation. Margaret turned to me. "As co-founder, you have the floor." I hadn't prepared a dramatic statement. I didn't need one. "I wrote the original governance framework," I said evenly. "The consent clause was not a technicality. It was a safeguard. It exists so that no founder can unilaterally reallocate equity or dilute ownership without transparency. I paused, letting the words settle. I did not escalate publicly. I did not contact regulators. I requested internal review. That is the responsible path. Silence followed. Kevin's eyes stayed on the table. I did not refuse expansion. I continued. I refused undisclosed transfer. Margaret folded her hands. The motion before us, she said, is permanent removal of Kevin Hayes as Chief Executive Officer. Conversion of his voting authority into a reduced equity structure pending restructuring, and appointment of Monica Hayes as Chief Strategy Officer with controlling voting oversight under revised governance bylaws. The words were clinical. The consequences were not. Kevin finally looked up. You're stripping me of the company I built, he said quietly. No, Margaret replied. We are correcting governance breach. The vote was called. Hands rose deliberately. One by one. Majority. Permanent. Kevin did not argue. He simply nodded once, as if something inevitable had finally arrived. Margaret outlined the next steps. Revised governance documents would be filed. Investors would receive formal communication. Executive authority would transition immediately. I felt no surge of triumph, only a steady sense of alignment. After the meeting adjourned, Kevin remained seated. I never thought it would end like this, he said without looking at me. It didn't have to. I replied, You could have signed. Yes, I said softly. And you would have erased me. He exhaled slowly. I underestimated you. You underestimated the structure. I corrected. That was the real truth. Outside the building, reporters were not waiting. There was no public spectacle, just quiet procedural change. My phone buzzed as I stepped into the car. An official update from the Toronto immigration firm. Application status. Suspended indefinitely due to unresolved ownership verification and executive authority restructuring. Suspended indefinitely. Not denied. But functionally finished. I closed the email. The visa had been the catalyst. The governance had been the battleground. Later that afternoon, I drafted the company's official communication to investors and employees. Following a comprehensive governance review, Hayes Renewable Systems has adopted strengthened structural safeguards to ensure transparency and fiduciary integrity. Executive leadership has transitioned to reinforce long-term stability. No mention of marriage. No mention of affair. No mention of Canada. Just stability. That evening, Kevin returned home to pack personal documents. Are you satisfied? He asked. I'm stabilized, I said again. He looked around the house, at framed photos from early investor dinners, garage prototypes, trade show booths. We built this together, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. And now it operates under the structure we agreed to. He gave a faint, humorless laugh. You always did think 5 steps ahead. I thought about safeguards, I said. He nodded slowly. I should have remembered that. After he left the room, I sat at the kitchen table where he had once slid the visa folder toward me. You just need to sign. Those words felt almost naive now. The board had voted. The equity had shifted. The visa had stalled. But what mattered most was not the suspension. It was the correction. He had believed power lived in executive authority. Elizabeth had believed power lived in legal interpretation. They were both wrong. Power lived in the clause no one thought to remove. And I had written it. The future of the company no longer depended on whether I would sign. It depended on whether I would lead. And for the first time since this began, that decision was entirely mine. Kevin asked to meet 2 days after the vote. Not at the house. Not at the office. At a private conference room in a mid-range hotel near O'Hare. Neutral territory where neither of us had emotional leverage. I agreed on one condition. My attorney will be present, I said over the phone. There was a pause before he replied. Fine. When I entered the room, Kevin looked different. Less polished. Less certain. Rebecca sat beside me, silent and observant. Kevin didn't waste time. The board is considering permanent restructuring of my equity, he said. If this continues, I lose majority voting rights permanently. That's already happened, I said calmly. He swallowed. They're discussing additional dilution to rebalance control. Rebecca remained still. Kevin leaned forward. If you agree to withdraw any potential regulatory disclosure, I can negotiate internally. We can stabilize this without further damage. There it was. You're asking me to suppress documented findings, I said evenly. I'm asking you to prevent escalation. Rebecca spoke for the first time. Are you implying there are undisclosed matters beyond what has already been reviewed? Kevin hesitated. No, then there is nothing to suppress, she said. Kevin exhaled sharply. You don't understand the optics. He said to me, if this turns into a regulatory review, valuation collapses. I never contacted regulators, I said. But you could... Yes. Silence stretched between us. Kevin shifted strategies. I'll step down publicly. I'll remove Elizabeth from any advisory connection. I'll accept a minority position. Just stop pushing. I watched him carefully. I'm not pushing, I said. I'm standing where the structure already placed me. He ran his hand across his forehead. You're taking everything. No, I said. I'm taking back balance. He leaned back in his chair, defeated for the first time. Rebecca interjected calmly. What specific agreement are you proposing? Kevin slid a draft document across the table. Preliminary restructuring agreement. It outlined the following. Formal resignation as CEO. Equity redistribution to create controlling founder oversight under revised bylaws. Withdrawal of pending international expansion. Mutual non-disparagement clause. No admission of wrongdoing. I read it slowly. And in exchange? I asked. You agree not to escalate beyond internal governance channels. Which I haven't, I said. But you won't. He pressed. Rebecca looked at me. The audit findings are already documented internally, she said carefully. The board controls external disclosure. Not you. Kevin's jaw tightened. You could still raise concerns publicly, he said. I won't, I replied calmly. As long as transparency remains intact. He searched my face, as if trying to detect hidden intent. You're really not trying to destroy this, he said. I never was. The tension shifted slightly. Kevin exhaled. If I sign this, I lose majority control permanently. You lost it when you ignored the bylaws, I said quietly. He looked down at the document. I built the engineering side, he said. And I built the legal and investor structure, I replied. Neither of us argued that point. Rebecca leaned forward. We will need written confirmation of governance reforms, she said. Dual authorization for capital transfers. Mandatory related party disclosure. Preservation of founder consent clause. Kevin nodded faintly. Done. And divorce proceedings remain separate, she added. Yes, he said. That word carried less resistance than before. After a long moment, Kevin picked up the pen. He signed. The sound of ink on paper felt louder than it should have. He slid the document toward me. I didn't sign immediately. I read every line again. Not because I distrusted it, because I understood what signatures meant now. Then I signed, not surrender, not retaliation, correction. When the meeting ended, Kevin remained seated for a moment. I thought I was being strategic, he said quietly. You were being unilateral, I replied. He nodded once. Elizabeth withdrew representation, he added. Her firm didn't want exposure. I assumed they wouldn't. He stood slowly. Was any of this about revenge? He asked. No, I said. It was about refusing to be removed quietly. He absorbed that. Later that afternoon, the board ratified the restructuring agreement. Executive authority permanently transferred. Founder voting oversight rebalanced. Expansion plan formally withdrawn. An internal memo was drafted for investors emphasizing governance reinforcement. No scandal. No public spectacle. Just structural recalibration. That evening, I sat alone in my office at headquarters, reviewing the updated bylaws. The consent clause remained intact, now strengthened. Kevin sent one final message before midnight. I should have remembered who drafted the original framework. I didn't reply, because this had never been about reminding him. It had been about proving that structures matter more than assumptions. The visa was effectively dead. The dilution attempt reversed. The board aligned. For the first time since that folder slid across the kitchen island, I felt something close to equilibrium. He thought the signature would erase me. Instead, it restored me. And this time, the structure was written clearly enough that no one would ever mistake my role again. The official announcement went out on Monday morning. By 9 May, every employee at Hayes Renewable Systems had received the internal memo. Following a comprehensive governance review, leadership has transitioned to reinforce fiduciary integrity and long-term structural stability. Kevin Hayes will step down as Chief Executive Officer. Monica Hayes will assume the role of Chief Strategy Officer with expanded governance oversight. No mention of scandal. No mention of immigration. No mention of marriage. Just structure. I stood in the conference room as department heads gathered for the first leadership alignment session under the new framework. Their expressions were cautious, but not hostile. Stability was what they wanted. I'm not here to dismantle what we built, I began. I'm here to reinforce it. I outlined the new policies clearly. Dual authorization required for any capital transfer exceeding a specified threshold. Mandatory board disclosure of any related party transactions. Preservation and reaffirmation of founder consent protections. Independent audit review every quarter for expansion initiatives. No one interrupted. No one argued. Because the language wasn't personal. It was protective. After the meeting, Daniel approached me quietly. Investors responded positively, he said. They appreciate the clarity. Clarity. That word felt like oxygen. By afternoon, industry blogs began reporting on governance reform strengthens renewable startup. The narrative was contained. Controlled. Kevin cleared out his office that same day. He moved methodically, not angrily. When I stepped inside to retrieve a file I needed, he was standing by the window, looking out over the parking lot. I never thought this room would look different, he said without turning. It doesn't, I replied. The structure does. He gave a faint smile. You always did think in frameworks? And you always thought frameworks were optional? He turned to face me. I was wrong. The admission didn't feel triumphant. It felt final. I wasn't trying to compete with you, he said quietly. I thought I was leading. You were, I said. Until you decided leadership meant bypassing consent. He nodded slowly. I lost perspective. Yes. There was no bitterness in my voice. Just fact. He gathered the last box from his desk. What happens to Elizabeth? He asked. I don't manage her consequences, I said. He hesitated. Her firm initiated an internal ethics review, he admitted. The visa file is officially withdrawn. Withdrawn. Not pending. Not suspended. Gone. I'm sorry, he said suddenly. For the affair. For the maneuvering. For underestimating me. I didn't ask. I know, I replied. Later that week, I finalized the divorce settlement in a quiet courtroom. No drama. No spectacle. Asset division reflected updated equity structure. My shares were preserved under the revised governance agreement. Kevin retained a reduced but meaningful stake. Fair? That mattered to me. I did not want him erased. I wanted balance restored. The judge signed the final decree with routine efficiency. Marriage dissolved. Structure intact. Back at headquarters, I implemented the final phase of governance reform. I created a founder mentorship program for female executives within the company. I required new executives to complete fiduciary training before assuming authority. I established a transparent investor communication dashboard so that no strategic shift would ever occur quietly again. Each step felt less like revenge and more like reinforcement. One evening, as I reviewed quarterly projections alone in my office, I opened the original incorporation document again. 9 years ago, I had typed our names side by side. Kevin Hayes, Monica Hayes. Founding shareholders. Equal consent required. He had once laughed at the clause. Now it was embedded deeper than ever. My phone buzzed. An email from Kevin. Company valuation recovered faster than expected. You were right about governance reassurance. I stared at the message for a moment before closing it. This wasn't about being right. It was about being precise. Weeks passed. The board's confidence solidified. Investors renewed commitments. Employees stopped whispering. Stability replaced speculation. One afternoon, I stood in the same boardroom where Kevin had once said everything was already arranged. The same polished table. The same leather chairs. The difference was not power. It was clarity. I didn't need to dominate the room. I just needed the structure to hold. The visa file was closed. The dilution attempt reversed. The executive authority corrected. And the company was stronger than before. Not because someone won, but because someone refused to sign without understanding the consequences. For the first time since this began, I allowed myself to sit back in that chair and feel something close to peace. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Balance. And balance, written into bylaws instead of whispered in promises, lasts longer than any relocation plan ever could. 3 months after the restructuring, I stood alone in the boardroom again. The skyline outside the glass walls looked the same as it always had. Chicago steady and unbothered. Traffic flowing. Cranes rising in the distance. The world had not collapsed. No headlines screamed scandal. No reporters waited downstairs. And yet everything in my life had shifted. The quarterly numbers were strong. Investor confidence had stabilized. The internal governance audit returned clean. The founder consent clause, once treated like a technicality, was now referenced in every strategic meeting. It was no longer invisible. Neither was I. Earlier that morning, I had received formal confirmation from the Toronto firm. The investment visa petition had been permanently closed. No refiling, no extension, no appeal. Administrative language. Clinical, final. I read the notice twice. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it. He had once told me, "You just need to sign." Such a simple sentence. Such a dangerous assumption. I walked back to my office and placed the printed notice in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder, not of betrayal, of structure. Kevin and I no longer spoke unless it was strictly related to governance matters. Our divorce had been finalized quietly. The settlement reflected reality. I retained controlling equity under the revised structure. He maintained a reduced but protected share. We were no longer husband and wife. But we remained co-founders bound by documents that now made more sense than our marriage ever had. One afternoon, I received a short message from him. I underestimated what you built. No apology this time. No defense. Just recognition. I stared at the words for a long moment. Underestimation had been the foundation of everything that followed. Underestimating my legal literacy. Underestimating the bylaws. Underestimating the clause that required unanimous founder approval for share transfer. Underestimating the woman who drafted it. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to clarify. At headquarters, I spent the next few weeks implementing a mentorship initiative for young female executives within our company. We reviewed contracts together. We walked through shareholder protections. We analyzed what related party transactions truly meant in practice. I told them something I had learned the hard way. Power rarely announces itself loudly. It hides in structure. It hides in signatures. It hides in the quiet lines most people skip over. One evening, as the office emptied and the city lights began to glow, I opened the original incorporation agreement again. 9 years ago, we had signed it in a small rented office with folding chairs and borrowed optimism. Kevin had laughed at the redundancy of equal consent. "Of course we'll always agree." He had said, we hadn't, but the document had protected me anyway. That was the difference between promises and provisions. Elizabeth never contacted me again. I heard through industry channels that her firm had distanced itself quietly. No public scandal, just professional recalibration. The plan to relocate to Canada dissolved without drama. What remained was something stronger than revenge. Clarity. I never destroyed the company. I never exposed secrets to create chaos. I enforced what was already written. And that was enough. One afternoon, during a strategy meeting, a junior analyst asked why we had tightened governance so aggressively. I smiled slightly. Because clarity protects growth, I said. That was the truth. Not anger. Not humiliation. Protection. Months ago, I had stood in my kitchen holding a folder that threatened to erase me from my own creation. Today, I sat at the head of a board table not because I fought louder, but because I read carefully. The difference mattered. Sometimes people think revenge requires noise. It doesn't. Sometimes it only requires restraint. And the courage not to sign. As I locked my office for the evening, I thought about how many women are told they just need to sign. Just a document. Just a transfer. Just a small technicality. No one tells them that small technicalities decide empires. If there is anything this experience taught me, it's this: never dismiss the fine print. Never assume silence equals weakness. And never underestimate the person who understands the structure beneath your success. If you've ever been underestimated in your own marriage, business, or partnership, if you've ever been told that your role was supporting while someone else took center stage, I want to know your thoughts. Would you have signed? Or would you have paused? Share your perspective in the comments. I read them carefully. If this story resonated with you, if you believe knowledge is the strongest form of protection, consider supporting this channel so more stories like this can reach women who need them. Stay here if you value intelligence over impulse, structure over spectacle, and quiet strength over loud destruction. Because sometimes, the most powerful move isn't fighting harder. It's knowing exactly when not to sign.